If you have questions about building and manipulating trends within DeltaV's Process History View, then you've come to the right place. Whether you're an operator, engineer, or a plant manager, data trends are important, and this video will help enable you to view what you need when you need it. Our aim is to provide you with an overview of the application's mechanics, which will help you become a Process History View expert. I'll walk you through a number of the program's options and details. My name is Ty Murphy, and I'm the Control System Sales Engineer with R.S. Stover Company, located in Marshalltown, Iowa. Let's go ahead and take a look at the topics we're going to cover. By the end of this tutorial, you'll know how to use the Configure Chart window to make changes to your plots. You'll also be familiar with the details associated with adding tags to a trend. Next, we'll cover how to make multiple plots on the same page. After that, we'll cover several ways to manipulate and scale the y-axis, and then we'll move down to the legend, and I'll explain how you can use that to your advantage to display data pertinent to your needs. Lastly, we'll talk about the mechanics of scrolling through time on the x-axis, and the most effective method based on what you're trying to accomplish. Alright, we got Process History View loaded up, and I've selected eChart. I like eCharts because we're actually pulling in information from two DeltaV historians. We're taking in event data from the Event Chronicle that will be displayed down in this area, and we're also plotting data points from the Continuous Historian, and that'll be trended up here. So before we talk about what I have in this area, I want to talk about this Configure Chart window. This is going to act as kind of the home base for our eChart. So anytime that you want to make a change and you don't know where to go, come back to this window and you'll find it in here. The other toolbar items and right clickables are auxiliary, but almost everything is held within this Configure Chart window. So let's talk about what we have loaded in here. I've pulled in some tags around a simulated heat exchanger that I have, just to spare you the time of going through that. We have the product outlet temperature of the heat exchanger. We've got the set point, we've got the inlet temperature, and the flow rate. Let's also add the flow rate of steam in the heat exchanger just to get some practice in adding tags. So I'm going to double click, and a new Configure Trend window pops up. I'm going to browse for the tag, select the module, and I'm looking for flow steam, and I want the current value. So that just automatically goes in here. Let's look at some of the other details in this window. We can choose whether or not we want the y-axis for this trend. We can put it on the right side. We can choose whether or not we want to see associated events. You can also change the sample color. Go ahead and change that to something else. You can use an additional descriptor, and then you can also manipulate your Y scale here, but we can do all this later. Another thing that I want to mention, but we'll come back to later, is in this window you have the option to enter a different time scale than the rest of the trends. So we'll come back to that. That's pretty much everything for this window. Let's hit OK, and you can see it's thrown in here. Now let's take a look at the next tab, timescale. Alright, so first thing here, this asterisk in Process History View means current time. So these three data entry boxes need to be in sync with one another. So that means if I change the span, something else has to change. So if I change my span to 4 hours, time start automatically changes. So yeah, let's go ahead and look at 4 hours of data. And important things to note here is that there's a myriad of different ways to enter data. You can enter absolute time, and an example is given down here. That's what we have shown right now. You can also do relative entries, so things like yesterday, today, Monday. And an example that they give down here is Monday plus 10 hours, and that just means the most recent Monday at 10 a.m. Another thing I want to explain a little further is span. Span is going to be important later when we're describing how to effectively maneuver through time on the x-axis. So the span is how much you can see on the x-axis. So a subtle difference here that you might not be aware of initially is that you see here we have days, hours, minutes. So it's a pretty subtle difference. Right now I have a 4-hour span, but if I hit the space bar, look how my time start changed. Now we have 4 days of data just by adding a space. So subtle differences to be aware of. I'm going to go ahead and backspace and go back to 4 hours of data. Next tab is the multiple y-axes. We'll come back to that here in a second, but let's get this data plotted. Hit OK. And now we have some lines. This is a lot to look at though. We have different scales. I'm not even sure all the data is showing up on here. Let's go ahead and see if we can't make this a little bit easier to maneuver around in. So I'm going to right click, and then I'm going to go back to our home base, which is configure chart. Next thing I want to do is let's say I want to make a different plot. I want to have one plot for my temperature and one plot for my flow rates. On this right, over here on the right side, you have this new axes column. I'm going to go ahead and check the box that's in line with the first trend that I want on a new plot. So that's my product flow. Everything below this check is going to appear on the new plot. And as you can see, you can have however many new ones. Another important thing to know is if I want to move this up to the temperature plot for whatever reason, simply select it, hit the up, and notice how it moves up the line. But let's put it back on the flow rate plot. Alright, so we've done that. We're not done yet though. We need to hop back over here to the multiple y-axis. Here you see percent of y-axis. All this means is the percent of the area that you want the plot to take up. So this is your area. This represents 100% where my mouse is. Let's say I want my plots to be equivalent. So I'm going to do 50% for the first one. I believe my other box was checked in parameter 4. So let's go ahead and put 50% there. We add up to 100%, so that's good. Let's hit OK. Alright, now we have 2 plots. Makes it a little bit easier to discern. So now, let's take a look at scaling the y-axis and different ways to do that. So, first thing I notice here is that I don't have one of my plots. Now, there's a couple ways to change your y-axis. The first one that I want to show is to come down here to your legend and left click to select, right click, and then come down here to set Y scale. Now you can either do this manually, where you will enter the values for the y-axis, or you can simply auto scale. We'll do that. And as you can see, Process History View decided what would be appropriate y-axis scale for the data within this time range. Another way that we can manipulate the y-axis, if we come up here to the upper plot, is to simply left click on an axis and drag it. So there are a couple different ways, and this can all be done from the configure chart window as well. So now that we know how to manipulate the y-axis, let's come back down here and take a closer look at the legends. So I'm going to right click, and let's first take a look at the legend columns. So here we can add additional pieces of information to our legends. For example, if I wanted to know where my window begins and ends for trends, because I plan on scaling these differently, I can go ahead and add those in, hit OK, and you can see that those appear right over here. Another thing that we can look at is the different ways to plot the data points. Default style is going to be a line, where a line is drawn between the two data points. Another way, there are 5 different ways that we can plot it, and descriptions are given in the bottom left, but I'll just give you an example with step, where instead of a line being drawn between 2 points, a step is drawn. So if you take a look at the dark green line on our top plot, I'll go ahead and change this to step, and you can see that we don't have the sharp peaks anymore. We just have steps. So there are a couple different ways to plot. I'll go ahead and change that back. So you can play around here in the legend. The next thing that I want to talk about is the view chart option up here. Sorry, my recording box is in the way. No. There we go. So if you go to view and then options, you'll get this new window that pops up. Here we can change the font size. I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So if it's too small on your screen, it's an easy way to do it. Next, we'll come over here to chart and theme preferences. You can add grid lines. You can choose whether or not you want to display axis labels. Those are kind of nice when you're plotting a lot of data. You can show the data points. Another fun thing that you can do is change your theme. If you select preset here, you have all these different options to take a look at. I just prefer the silver theme, so we'll go ahead and do that. And I'm also going to display the y-axis labels just so you guys can see what it looks like. Yep. Alright, and now event colors can also be altered by type. So that'll change this over here. You can change time references. And then this is another interesting bit. You can change the color of the lines depending on their status, the signal status. So if I were to enable those, any bad signal would be shown in red. Well, in this case, any status other than good would be shown in red. This can be pretty handy if your instruments enable you to look at their signal strength. So that's all for this window. Now let's talk about something that can be a little confusing if you don't understand exactly how it works, and that's navigating around the x-axis and changing your time. So to get a look at an exact piece of time, I'm going to recommend that you right click, go to configure chart, and change your time scale and do it in absolute time. So for example, if I want to look at April 29th, we'll say, I'll type in 29 of April in 2016 at, I don't know, 11 a.m. Now my span here, time end changed. So let's go ahead and take that back to current. Now the span shows 5 days and 34 minutes. Automatically updates. Hit OK. And now the span has changed. So to look back to a specific point in time, that's going to be your best bet. Another thing, I told you this time span would be important, is you can change that time span right up here to up to a day. So let's talk about doing that. Let's look at a day's worth of data. So here we have 1 day across the x-axis. Now we have these scroll buttons up on top, and when you first click them, it looks like they might just be moving to random times. However, if we look at where we started and where we go, we can find out that these small buttons actually move you, so this would move us back 10% of what our time span is. So if our time span is 1 hour, 10% of 1 hour is 6 minutes, so that's how far we would move. Make sense? So if our time span is a day and we hit this, we get moved about just under 2.5 hours. Now these double arrows move you an additional 90% of your time span. So you're going to notice that as we talk about the x-axis, Process History View doesn't necessarily think in terms of set intervals. It thinks in terms of percentages. So keep that in mind as you're scrolling. As your time span increases, so does the rate at which you're scrolling. So that brings us to our next point. We have these two buttons right here: increase time span and decrease time span. So the decrease time span is going to reduce the span by 33%. So you'll notice that this changed. It went from 1 day, 24 hours, down to 16 hours. Do it again. We reduce by another 33%. So 33% of 16 hours. So now we're at 10 hours and 40 minutes. If we go back to our original span, and now we want to increase our time span, the x-axis is going to be increased by 50%. So now we started with a day, now we're at a day and a half. So we went from 24 hours to 36 hours. So now if we hit it again, we're going to go to 54 hours. So I know that can be a little confusing. I'll throw up a slide at the end of the video just so that you have a quick reference to how that's going to work. The last thing that I want to show you is how to move the x-axis for a single trend. So let's go ahead and go back out to a day. I have a very steady state heat exchanger. Go back to 4 hours worth of data, so we have some variation to look at. Let's say that for whatever reason I would like to look at my product flow rate for or look at it in the past on this same trend. I select it, and then you'll notice that we have these buttons on the toolbar up here: trend scroll back and trend scroll forward. So if I click right here, we have time-stamped values. We are at May 4th today at 10 a.m. Now if I go back, we're going to go back in time for this one trend at 50% of our time span. So that means we're going to go back by 2 hours just for that trend. So instead of 9:59, we're going to be looking at 7:59 just for the product flow. So we hit that. We get a dotted line here to signify that This is on a different time scale than the rest of it. Let's take a look at our timestamp. Everything else is at 9:59, but our product flow is at 7:59. And we can keep going back. We can go forward. Unlike the scroll buttons, both the trend forward and trend back are equal to half of the time span, so it doesn't matter there. If you want to get back to original time, you can simply hit this button up here on shift, and we're back on track. This time shifting for a single trend can also be done by right clicking. And as I mentioned before, if we right click and go back to configure chart and double click on a trend, we can also move it back using absolute time. For example, I can type in May 1st, 2016 at 9 a.m. And it doesn't look like I had the simulation running then because our red trend disappeared. But the principle still holds true. This is the best way to move a single trend back to a particular instance in time. So that's how you would go about shifting one trend on the x-axis and leaving the others. The last thing that I would show you, and probably something that you've already figured out, is to zoom in. Simply click and drag over the area, and you will continue to zoom in. As promised, here's a quick summary of the mechanics behind the buttons on the toolbar. So go ahead and take a screenshot of that if you think that'll help. Otherwise, just keep it around a reference. So in summary, we covered the configure chart window, details around adding tags to make a trend. We talked about how you can make multiple plots and the different ways to scale the y-axis. We also talked about what was within the legends and how you can scale the x-axis and move around in time. Thanks so much for watching this video, and if you have any further questions or comments, feel free to visit our website where you can get a hold of me at www.rsstover.com. Thanks again.